My name is Andrea Sharana, and I am Associate Professor and Director of the Center for Defense and Security Studies at the University of Manitoba. And I'm very proud to be sponsoring this book talk with the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies. Anyways, Alexander has written Military Alliances in the 21st Century by Wiley Press in 2021. And what it does is it's one of the first books to actually explore the politics behind these security arrangements. And he does it across 6 thematic chapters, looking at the formation of alliances, issues of entrapment, abandonment, burden sharing, warfare, and then actually termination of alliances. We're so lucky to have him here today to unpack this, and also keeping in mind the current context that we have with NATO and the Ukraine crisis. So without further ado, I want to hand this over to my co-chair. We have Yulia Ivanuk. Yulia.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sharon. The Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies is honored to coordinate this event today, together with the Center for Defense and Security Studies, and extremely honored to host Dr. Lanoszka and discuss his recent book, Military Alliances in the 21st Century, here today. So just a small housekeeping item. Today's meeting is video recorded, and feel free to submit your questions into the chat box, and we'll try to address them during the Q&A. Now I'd like to proceed to introduce Dr. Lanoszka. Alexander Lanoszka is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and in the Balsillie School of International Affairs at the University of Waterloo. He's also the Ernest Bevin Associate Fellow of Euro-Atlantic Geopolitics at the newly created Council on Geostrategy. He's a co-leader of the European NATO subgroup of the Defense and Security Foresight Group. His research addresses issues in alliance politics, nuclear strategy, and theories of war, and has appeared in international security, security studies, international affairs. His books include Atomic Assurance, The Alliance Politics of Nuclear Proliferation, and the most recent one, Military Alliances in the 21st Century, an extremely timely and important contribution, which we will be discussing today. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Lanoszka.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very grateful to the Center for Defense and Security Studies and the Center for Ukrainian and Canadian Studies for organizing this event. I've never been to Winnipeg and would like to one day visit, but I'm more than happy to be meeting with you all virtually all the same. So today I'll be speaking about my latest book, Military Alliances in the 21st Century, why I wrote it, how I've organized it, and what are its main arguments. And I'll be speaking for about the next 35 minutes before turning over to a proper discussion. So the first thing I want to say about it is that, if I may just change the slide, is that I've come to believe now more than when I actually was writing this book, that alliance politics truly is the meat of international relations. That is, so much of international politics turns on how groups of people organized into states, for better or for worse, make or do not make commitments or pledges or promises to other groups of people further away in light of the common security challenges that they face that might indeed be produced from yet other groups of people. And unfortunately, these sorts of dynamics are very much alive in our present situation. Many aspects of Russia's ongoing war with Ukraine are shaped by alliance considerations, whether it is with respect to the much debated role that NATO might have played in shaping the very onset of this war, whether it's with respect to the participation of Belarus in this conflict, the discussions that we've seen unfold over no-fly zones or other forms of military assistance, or the fears that Ukraine's own Western neighbors might have that they could be the targets of Russian aggression in the future. But when it comes to alliance politics as a general topic, however, we have a fairly large body of scholarship that we've seen emerge in the last 30 years, one that has been built upon new fleshed out concepts, greater access to diplomatic archives, as well as various cutting edge methodological tools. Yet we don't really have a book that tries to put all the pieces together that make up alliance politics. And indeed, the last book that really tried to do so was written in 1997 by Glenn Snyder by the name of Alliance Politics. But that book, again, was published in 1997, 25 years ago, and its case evidence is largely drawn from the pre-1914 period. Of course, I think as such that it behooves us to understand how much and what sort of knowledge we have truly accumulated with respect to the operation of military alliances. And so, modestly speaking, my goal with this book is to synthesize the state of the art in the field of international relations, to make new arguments that challenge pieces of conventional wisdom as to how these sorts of security arrangements work, and to inspire, hopefully, new research in this growing area. So in so doing, I've reached the following conclusion, and I do so hesitantly because in graduate school, I was told repeatedly never to throw up my hands in the air and to say that the world is complex and leave it at that. But that's more or less what I'm going to try to do here, albeit in a slightly more sophisticated fashion than that. Alliances do not actually make much sense, quite frankly. And they're often very paradoxical and they work in very counterintuitive ways. And as such, they're very difficult to manage and they defy oftentimes explanations, precisely because the outcomes that we care about in international relations, outcomes that might seem to be related to military alliances, very rarely are ever the result of factors operating systematically. In other words, we like to think of alliances as being causes for certain behaviors or certain outcomes that we care about, like war, for instance. But really, we can hardly be confident in saying that they are causes as such, precisely because alliances, as a broader concept, tend to be proxies for all sorts of different variables and aggregating all sorts of confounding strategic interactions. So what I'm going to do over the course of this presentation is to unpack this big picture argument. Now, before proceeding, I should clarify what I mean here. A military alliance is an arrangement of two or more sovereign states on the basis of a written treaty that serves primarily to coordinate military policy towards at least one common goal. Thus, I have in mind arrangements like NATO, the US-South Korea alliance, the US-Japan alliance, the Collective Security Treaty Organization that Russia leads, the Warsaw Pact that the Soviet Union used to lead, the Triple Alliance, French and British alliances to Poland in the interwar period, and so on and so on. I therefore don't have in mind necessarily relations like those between the United States and Israel, Pakistan and China, Russia and China, United States and Saudi Arabia, and so forth, precisely because there's no underlying treaty. Why they have refrained from signing such a treaty for the purposes of building a military alliance still, I think, is very important, as we will see, and it's illuminating on its own right. So with this definition, and I'm sure that perhaps some people will have their eyebrows raised precisely because it insists so much on there being a treaty element, I proceed in the following matter with respect to this book. So this book ultimately is organized across those thematic chapters that my colleague mentioned earlier. And really it's like a tour d'horizon of how alliance politics operates from cradle to death with all the intervening alliance issues that might arise. Issues such as entrapment, abandonment, burden sharing, coalition warfare. Those are the issues that might come in play over the lifespan of alliance between formation and termination. So in the book, I take these issues in turn. And I do so by tackling key pieces of conventional wisdom that touch on these aspects of alliance management and alliance politics more generally. So the first piece of conventional wisdom, and when I say conventional wisdom, I don't mean to imply that everyone believes in this thing, that there's consensus across the board within the academic or policy community, but these are nevertheless common understandings shared by sufficiently large group of expert people. But the first piece of conventional wisdom relates to how military alliances form. And it is that states form alliances in order to balance against opposing power and or to gain influence over other states. This is an intuitive idea. Alliances balance against adversaries. That's the crux of balance of power theory. Power balances against power. And with respect to the influence portion, that again also has intuitive appeal because we can conjure up cases like the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, where there was that intent to exert influence over members of the Soviet bloc in Central Eastern Europe during the Cold War. The problem, at least from my perspective, is that this explanation is at best very insufficient. Indeed, we can identify all sorts of security relationships that do not qualify as alliances precisely because they lack treaty commitment. US-Israel, like I said, US-Saudi Arabia, Russia-China, China-Pakistan. These are all instances where you can observe balance of power considerations or influence considerations, but they lack that important treaty element. And so it seems to me that in order to balance against power, you don't necessarily need to have a treaty. And indeed, that just shows that this explanation is at best incomplete. And indeed, if we look at the record of alliances today, not many alliances actually exist, and most of them are in fact US-led, with the exception of some examples like the Collective Security Treaty Organization, led by Russia, as well as the alliance that China still has with North Korea. So I think when we step back, in light of these sorts of common understandings, I don't think we can ever actually arrive at a truly satisfactory systematic explanation as to why we have treaty alliances in some cases and not in others. But I think that also still behooves us to think about what exactly is the role played by having a treaty. Now, the common understanding here is that treaties serve to screen and to clarify the nature of the commitment at stake here. And so by having a treaty, countries can resolve what disagreements they might have. They can attach conditionalities. They can have precise terms as to how the alliance would operate. But the fact of the matter is, when you look at actual treaties undergirding these military alliances, there is some level of precision, but there's actually quite a lot of vagueness in there too. Article 5 is the classical example of just this very vagueness. Article 5 of the Washington Treaty or the North Atlantic Treaty simply states that an attack against one NATO member is simply an attack against all, but that does not actually say anything about what would follow if such an Article 5 situation were to take place. So I think it's more accurate to say that written treaties at once clarify and obfuscate, that they allow signatories to communicate their commitments internationally, both to domestic audiences, but also, of course, to other allies, potential or actual, or to adversaries on their own right. But they also permit sufficient vagueness that allow members of the alliance relationship some leeway that when push comes to shove, they don't necessarily have to go all in. So after all, those drafting these sorts of written commitments, they do so with the worry to some extent about how their pledges could in fact be manipulated or abused by the recipients, that they will be exploited for parochial or non-alliance goals. And so this leads me to the second piece of conventional wisdom that relates to entrapment concerns and abandonment concerns. And these are two issues that I unpack in two separate chapters. And the conventional wisdom here is that the alliance dilemma is the fundamental problem shared by all military alliances. And that the alliance dilemma relates to how to manage specifically the twin or dual fears of entrapment concerns and abandonment concerns. Now, entrapment fears relate to the concern that because of the military alliance that you extend to another country, you might get embroiled in a dispute or in a conflict with an adversary that you don't want to have. And abandonment concerns relate to the concern that in the event of a military crisis, your ally will decide not to support you and will leave you to the wolves at that. After all, war is very dangerous and much more expensive than it is to make the very pledges of commitment that these states do in peacetime. And so the alliance dilemma puts all this together to say that if you give a broad commitment to an ally, that ally might become much more confident, more adventurous in its foreign policy, such that it behaves much more aggressively than it otherwise would. However, if you scale back or narrow down that commitment, that ally might start fearing abandonment and might undertake other undesirable behaviors like nuclear proliferation because it feels like that's the best guarantee of its security, or to realign its foreign policy in a fairly dramatic manner. But the thing is that these fears, as often as they're given as opposites in the literature, actually tend to coexist. During the Trump years, for example, South Korea simultaneously worried about both entrapment and abandonment. Washington's renegotiating of various agreements with South Korea suggested that Washington could avail of itself of opportunities to cut South Korea loose. But at the same time, Trump's bellicose rhetoric of fire and fury obviously instilled the concern within South Korean government and society that South Korea could very well be caught in a hot war between North Korea and the United States, a hot war that it did not want. Moreover, the literature gives all sorts of contradictory guidance as to what drives entrapment fears, whether it's with respect to the alliance treaty itself, that giving one is sufficient to create entrapment, or that non-treaty allies like Israel entrap the United States, even though you would think not having the treaty in the first place should minimize those sorts of concerns, or the number of great powers that exist in the international system. There are more great powers. That seems to raise the value of individual allies, such that we see what scholars call chain gangbang, the belief that one ally is so essential to the balance of power that you go to great lengths to defend it. Concerns for reputation, that because you don't want to be seen as breaking your commitment, you follow through on that commitment no matter the cost, or various transnational networks that allow an ally to fool you into thinking that their interest is in fact your interest, as some have argued between Ukraine and Georgia in the 2000s and the United States. There are logical problems with each of these explanations that I don't necessarily want to get into, but what's actually fairly clear is that entrapment is in fact a very rare occurrence. Precisely because leaders do worry about entrapment, it becomes a self-denying prophecy, as it will. They take steps, they define the terms of the alliance treaty to attach conditions, to make the language more precise, to give themselves greater leeway in case the ally behaves recklessly or the adversary poses too much of a threat. And just because allies do fight, that does not necessarily mean that we've observed entrapment. It is possible that allies just want to fight. So take the example that many have given of chain gangbang that I mentioned earlier, that Germany believed that Austria-Hungary was absolutely essential to the balance of power, and that is why it gave a blank check in the summer of 1914. And because of that blank check, that created a dynamic that led to not just a regional war, but a global war. However, there's sufficient evidence to show that the Germans simply wanted to fight, and they saw a pretext at that time to instigate one. And so the entrapment narrative sort of puts the cart before the horse. As for abandonment, states have rational reasons to think always that no ally will support them in a prospective war. When fears become so intense, these fearing states might take dramatic measures like I mentioned earlier, nuclear proliferation, a dramatic realignment of their foreign policy, accommodation of the adversary. But these things happen actually quite rarely in international politics. In the case of nuclear proliferation, for example, South Korea undertook a nuclear weapons program in the late 1960s, early 1970s, precisely because it feared that the United States was cutting loose from East Asia in light of its performance in the Vietnam War. But this very observation suggests that abandonment concerns do vary in intensity. It may be always rational to be worried about abandonment, but clearly these things do wax and wane in their intensity as to drive state behavior. So what might affect the intensity of abandonment concerns? Well, the degree in which interests or foreign policy priorities overlap. The more that they do, the more confident you can be that your ally will actually fight, because it'll be in their interest to do so. The level of alliance consultations that exist. Abandonment fears are ultimately a concern about being caught off guard by your ally. Having a seat at the table minimizes these sorts of concerns. Military power is also another piece to the equation. If your ally is much stronger than your adversary, then that obviously will affect the adversary's calculations to go about war, which will help soothe over whatever abandonment concerns you might generally have. And indeed, if your ally is not stronger or might be at parity with your adversary, they can still take steps in this domain. They can, for example, position military personnel with all of the combat power that they can bring to bear in order to, in your territory, to demonstrate skin in the game, their willingness to fight the adversary if it were to attack that ally, as well as to raise directly the cost of aggression to that adversary. Hence, what we're seeing in Central Eastern Europe, whereby Poland and the Baltic countries are seeking more and more presence on the part of the United States and other NATO allies on their own territory. So the fundamental issue here is that, yeah, the alliance dilemma kind of exists, but it's very easy to overstate, and that there are tools for managing it. And the empirical record is a little uneven to this effect. The third piece of conventional wisdom is one that obviously has received a lot of attention during the Trump years. And that relates, of course, to burden sharing. Now, this is a bit of a minefield for me because I don't want to imply that militaries, or states rather, only spend on their militaries for the sake of alliance politics or collective defense. They obviously would have many other motives at play here that drive their decision-making here. But the conventional wisdom is that members of US alliances, at least, must do more to bear their fair share of the common defense burden. And the reason why I think it's important to challenge this piece of conventional wisdom, or this folk wisdom, as it were, is that, for one, it is historically very slippery. Literally every single American president, since at least Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s, have complained about burden sharing, no matter what the actual level of defense spending was made by their allies in Europe or elsewhere. The other issue, too, is theoretical. Quite frankly, the argument's unclear in terms of how it works. Now, the underlying issue is that of collective action. The more allies or actors that we expect to contribute to a particular good, the more free riding we can expect to happen. And as such, the provision of that collective good will become increasingly problematic. And of course, in this context here, the collective good is collective defense, and the contributions are in the form of military spending. Now, in a world of nuclear deterrence such as ours, how does military spending actually map on to collective defense? Aren't nuclear weapons supposed to be the main guarantee against territorial invasion, an issue that has become very hotly debated in recent months in light of the growing conversation that I've seen in some quarters as to Ukraine's decision in the 1990s to rid itself of the strategic nuclear weapons stockpile it inherited from the Soviet Union in exchange for very problematic assurances with regards to its territorial integrity on the part of nuclear powers. These issues are not just conceptual or even novel. So in the Cold War, we see West German decision makers grapple with this problem. They feared for some time that spending more on defense, on their own militaries, would signal, in fact, a willingness to fight a nuclear war, which in turn would actually undermine deterrence, let alone collective defense, because it might risk provoking the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. So what I want to suggest here is that the relationship between military spending on the one hand and collective defense on the other hand is far from linear. And the reason is that military technology itself is the main variable here. In fact, for this reason, do we observe burden sharing debates only really emerge in the 1950s and not before. And indeed, they largely have involved the United States in the nuclear age with the alliances that it's had, underpinned by, of course, nuclear weapons. And I think part of the reason is that military technology itself has become very complex for technological, organizational, or doctrinal, and human-related reasons. Technological, you just need more component parts. It's harder to have a defense industry sustainably produce these sorts of items. Organizational, because just requires more complex organization in the sense that adoption requires very many moving parts. It's not just a matter of raising soldiers and giving them weapons. You actually have a fairly sophisticated apparatus to do so. And human-related reasons is that your average soldier has to be much more intelligent than what was the case long ago. So all of this puts a premium on long-term investment, which creates an incentive for spending on your military no matter what. But again, nuclear deterrence can cut across or cut against these incentives. Because of a stable peace, if you believe in mutually assured destruction, for example, you might not have a reason to really spend much on your military. Or because, as I said, spending on conventional can, in fact, signal a greater use of nuclear weapons, and some allies might not want that. So again, I think this conventional wisdom has something going for it, but when we really think about the logic and the history of the concept, for me, it raises more eyebrows, and I don't think it's one that we should just take uncritically. So the next piece of conventional wisdom relates to warfare. And really, this comes to the heart of how often we think of alliances in terms of their ability to aggregate resources. Indeed, the conventional wisdom here that I tackle is that military alliances aggregate capabilities and thus allow member countries to confront security challenges more effectively. This is intuitive. The more resources you can pull together, the more resources that you have vis-a-vis your rivals, the more likely you are to prevail. Now, that, again, is a very intuitive thought. The theory is very appealing for this reason, but practice tells a very different story. Again, there are strategic, organizational, and technical factors that can create immense difficulties for states fighting together. The strategic factors could be that even though they're fighting in the same war, they have different interests. They operate in different theaters of operations. They might confront the adversary differently precisely because of the military power that the adversary can bring on any individual fighting ally. There are fears of defection that can ensue, whereby allies might worry that their partners would simply bolt midway through the war and sign separate peace agreements with the adversary. This is what happened, or this was a fear that was salient early in the First World War, whereby Britain feared that France and Russia would sign separate peace agreements. There are organizational factors that are at play here. There are command and control issues that ensue when countries with different military cultures and political goals try to work together. They might be very reluctant to have their own national forces submit to the authority of another country, precisely because they might believe that country might misuse their own forces. And of course, there are the technical factors that are at play here. Technical factors that relate to weapons, standardization, logistical issues, language even, communication, hardware and software. And so it does not actually matter how much mass or metal that you might bring to bear to the fight, but ultimately what matters is how you use it. And I think that's an issue that we're seeing all too well in how Russia has been fighting its own war of conquest against Ukraine in the last 6 or so weeks. It's got the mass, no one doubts that Russia has the mass, but its ability to employ various facets of its military power effectively across multiple vectors has been now under serious question and has disabused of us of a lot of notions that we might have had of Russia as a warfighting machine. And indeed, this case is instructive because it shows how difficult it is to fight, especially one that involves ground operations. But if Belarus were to enter the war on the side of Russia, in the sense that it contributes troops to the ground operations, of course, Belarus is already implicated in the war, then these challenges might actually worsen for Moscow because of the command and control issues that would be at play here, the differences in strategic aims that those countries would have. Indeed, Winston Churchill said the worst thing than fighting with allies is fighting without allies, and there is certainly a grain of truth here. The last piece of conventional wisdom touches on how alliances end. Now, intuitively, it is the view of many that military alliances are really only as useful for as long as the strategic circumstances that led to their emergence hold. And this is a common argument made by realists, assuming that alliances operate, or at least should operate, in the same way as they might have in the era of Bismarck, whereby alliances didn't really last for very long. And really, they lasted as per the casus foederis, or the reason for being. Yet this is a view that's strictly normative. It's not empirical, in fact. And in fact, there are various ways by which alliances can come to an end. All alliances do, even though we take for granted the longevity of some American-led alliances to this day. So one way of an alliance meeting its end is by way, indeed, of mission fulfillment, that they do what they set out to do, that they reach their end because their founding purpose has been fulfilled. Yeah, as a matter of fact, this only accounts for about 16% of all cases of alliances terminating, at least according to one study. And so one wonders why that's the case. I think one is that successful cooperation begets more cooperation, so there's no reason to dispense with something that worked. I think this was in part the case of NATO, where it did fulfill its original mission of deterring and defending against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed, but the organization had these security assets that still were very useful for the post-Cold War period. Another reason why we might see mission fulfillment being less of a way for alliances ending is that the problems driving these alliances are actually very difficult to solve and take a long time to address. And sometimes the founding problems might outlast the alliances themselves. You can think of the problem posed by Germany in the 19th and early 20th century was too big it was big enough to stir many anxieties about its power amongst its neighbors, but not big enough to, in fact, dominate them. And that was a problem that lasted 70, 80 years, outlasting many arrangements intended to address that very issue. Another way for an alliance to come to an end is by way, of course, of military defeat. This one, of course, is straightforward. Battlefield performance is sufficiently poor that the states making up the alliance experience massive upheaval as a result, and that has implications for the security arrangement that they have. An example that comes to mind here is, of course, Germany and Austria and Hungary in the First World War. Yet another way for alliance termination to come about is downgrading. So bringing an official end to a military alliance in peacetime might be too costly of an action. States might not be interested in pursuing deeper cooperation with their treaty allies, but they don't necessarily want to take bold steps that alienate those partners or alienate members of domestic society, or for that matter, encourage adversaries. And so to square this circle, states take steps to disinvest themselves from the arrangement. They lose interest, they roll back their involvement in military exercises, they participate in fewer consultations, just devote fewer resources to the alliance. In effect, the military alliance becomes zombie because it really just exists on paper. And so one example that comes to mind here is the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, or SEATO, that emerged in the 1950s, but lasted far longer than it probably should have before it died or expired in the 1970s. Now, some might actually find value in taking the costly action of formally ending a military alliance. And this brings me to unilateral abrogation. So hoping to demonstrate its sincerity in seeking normal ties with Beijing, Washington decided to cut loose its military alliance with Taiwan in the 1970s. And indeed, Beijing had demanded that Washington cut those ties in order to show its good faith in those negotiations regarding normalization. So here's again an instance where, yeah, you actually do want to formally end a treaty precisely because it makes someone else happy to do so, that they don't fear that you're trying to sucker them. And finally, there is a transformation whereby the alliance does not really end, but simply gets elevated to another type of alliance relationship or some other relationship. So for example, it could be the case that a bilateral relationship or alliance becomes folded into a multilateral one. And we see that with respect to Canada and the United States, from the Ogdensburg Agreement in the early 1940s into NATO, or for that matter, the British alliance with Portugal being folded into, of course, NATO when those two countries did join. So again, it's not really the case that military alliances are only as useful as for as long as the strategic circumstances that led to their emergence hold. So in putting all these arguments together, the big picture conclusion is again this, that alliances don't really make that much sense, that they actually operate in fairly intuitive ways, that a lot of our theories do break in trying to make sense of them. And that is why it's actually really difficult for policymakers and practitioners to go about alliance management effectively. It's extremely hard to do so, precisely because we don't have good, easy explanations for how these operate. Alliance-related outcomes, rarely, if ever, are the result of factors that operate systematically. There is a lot of guesswork here. There's a lot of uncertainty. There is a lot of strategic interaction that may or may not be seen, let alone understood, that shapes how these things operate. Now, again, I don't want to imply in saying all this that we know nothing about how alliances operate. I think we do, and with some fairly large confidence intervals to be sure. And I would not be rattling off the arguments that I have in the last half hour if I was totally nihilistic about our possibilities for understanding how these things work. Still, I think we need to at bottom recognize their complexity and embrace it. And I think one IR scholar, George Vishka, said it perfectly when he wrote a long time ago. It is impossible to speak of international relations without referring to alliances. The two often merge in all but name. For the same reason, it has always been difficult to say much that is peculiar to alliances on the plane of general analysis. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed reading the book, and I really loved how you organized it with those sort of 6 thematic chapters to sort of unpack the central thesis, which is that alliances can be very dysfunctional. Yuli and I are going to be asking you questions, but we also invite the audience to put questions in the chat, and we'll pass them along. But I was wondering if perhaps you could explain what are some of the positive consequences of alliances, because many of the issues, abandonment, war making, entrapment, all of these things can give the impression that alliances are dysfunctional and therefore have no redeeming features. But with NATO about to celebrate 73 years and having reinvented itself and expanded its members, there must be something positive that comes out of alliances for these member states.
Absolutely, and you would rather be in one than not, right? So as much as Estonia would always have existential questions about whether in an Article 5 situation, other allies would come to its support, there's no question that you'd rather be in that relationship than be without it. And unfortunately, what lends proof to that thesis is what has been happening in the last 15 years with respect to Russian aggression towards Georgia, and of course, Ukraine. It's not by accident that in his Senate confirmation hearings, Antony Blinken, as nominee for the Secretary of State position, said that NATO countries don't get attacked by Russia. Countries that aspire to join NATO do get attacked, right? But so as much as there is that basic benefit, which is huge, and I would definitely not understate it, there's still like a lot of things to have to unpack with respect to that particular statement.
I was just thinking sort of some of the democratizing incentives to be able to join NATO, you know, looking at your defense budget, your capabilities, the possibility for other offshoots, economic partnerships and the like. Why is it that NATO, for example, seems to have those, but other alliances maybe didn't? Is it because of the structure of the agreement, or was it the nature of the geopolitical times, or perhaps the members?
Right. No, so NATO is a very unique alliance precisely because it's multilateral and has a lot of breadth, and it's a very sophisticated organization in terms of the functional issue areas that it covers. And I think what we've done perhaps badly in the literature is to craft a lot of theories about how these things work on the basis of NATO. NATO is a very peculiar relationship, and it's really a piece, albeit a very big piece, of a larger security architecture that exists in Europe, such that you can't really separate NATO from other features of that security architecture, like nuclear sharing arrangements, which predated the nuclear planning group within NATO, European Economic Community, or now the European Union, all sorts of treaty arrangements about borders, and indeed democratization, as you've mentioned. But it does seem that one benefit, again, is greater trade. Some people have argued that precisely because of the trade benefits, that also allows for more military power to be purchased, and so that, you know, creates more and more good things from the alliance perspective. But again, like, we have to be good social scientists and, you know, think about, well, what actually came first? Was it the alliance that produced the economic relationship or the economic benefits, or is there something that produces both the economic relationship and the security relationship? And as such, that's where I get a little hesitant to pin causality on any of these sorts of issues.
Thank you so much, Alexander, once again for the great presentation and for the great discussion. I'd be really curious to hear your insight on the CSTO. We've started talking a little bit about NATO, and if you could characterize the CSTO for us, that would be great. Thank you.
Right. No, so the CSTO is extremely interesting to me at this very moment because it seemed to have reached both its high point and its low point in the span of a few weeks. It reached its high point with the intervention in Kazakhstan, as we saw a number of countries, including those like Belarus that had eschewed foreign intervention altogether in years past, take part, albeit in a limited way. And indeed, the mission was successful. It lasted very briefly, precisely because the aims of that intervention were very limited to suppress the mass protests that were rocking that country. But what we've seen in the last 6 weeks is a complete reversal of fortunes in that alliance. So I think after Kazakhstan, there was the sense that this was now a serious alliance, that this may have been zombie in the way that I described it. Uzbekistan, for instance, you know, came in, came out of it. Other countries were not entirely sure how to think of it, even the members themselves. But the Kazakhstan intervention seemed to spotlight a particular use for it. But now, with Russia flailing as it has in Ukraine by expending a lot of its own combat potential overall, not just the units that have been deployed there, to say nothing of the economic cataclysm that will eventually hit the Russian economy. You know, don't watch the ruble, watch what's happening in the factories elsewhere in the country. To say nothing of how Russia suspended exports of grain products to members of the Eurasian Economic Union, that, you know, overlaps in membership to some respect with the CSTO. This is going to be a massive problem for Russia to maintain a leadership role within that organization. And we're already starting to see countries like Azerbaijan, not within the alliance, but obviously with an interest in Nagorno-Karabakh, which obviously implicates Armenia, which is part of the alliance, take note and maybe pushing its own claims further than it otherwise would, precisely because it senses weakness. And we see Kazakhstan, again, pursue policies that are that distance itself away from Moscow and perhaps moving towards Beijing. And this is an abandonment of its like multi-vector policy. We do see some countries like Kyrgyzstan be rather quiet in all this, but Belarus, of course, has refused to take part in the ground operations, even though it does provide a staging ground for missile attacks and for Russian ground operations themselves. But we can see it clearly in the Belarusian context, there's very little popular will to step up Belarus's involvement in that conflict. And stepping up in that conflict would mean massive risks to Lukashenko's regime itself. So when you put all these things together, that does not suggest a happy future for the alliance. Now, whether it would meet any one of those fates that I described, I don't know. I would suspect that if I were a betting man, that some of these countries like Kazakhstan might simply downgrade it. They might downgrade their valuation of it. Armenia might become more skeptical because, after all, even in better times, Russia didn't really come to its aid. Now, Russia is going to experience tremendous difficulties in projecting a leadership or hegemonic position. And Belarusian society, I think, it has become increasingly alienated by Russian actions, such that Russia might itself be losing a constituency there. Maybe not in the short term, but certainly over the long term. So the long-term prospects for the CSTO, despite its high watermark in the Kazakhstan intervention, seem to be very dim, much more dim than that of NATO, of course.
Thanks. We have a question from Bryce Offenberger, which I'll just frame just a little bit differently, but get the spirit of it. Alliances are between two or more states, but given the complexity of today and the relationship between states and the military-industrial complex and big industries, and of course the technology that now they, as opposed to governments, are able to drive, do you see the construction of military alliances changing in the future, or even the definition of an alliance changing so it's not so state-centric?
So this was actually a popular idea about 15, 20 years ago. In fact, there were a number of expert observers who were commenting that alliances were coming to an end precisely for these reasons, that we're now in a world where non-state actors have become much more important, especially given what had happened in 9/11, that the United States, as a lone superpower, would prefer flexible ad hoc arrangements like the Coalition of the Willing that took part in the invasion of Iraq. And so these are arguments that have a fairly significant literature underpinning them. But I think what we've seen in the last 10 years, especially after 2014 with the Russian annexation of Crimea and the instigation of war in eastern Ukraine, has been to resuscitate these arrangements. It's that they actually look a lot more in operation than what we've seen in the past, in previous epochs. That the state itself has become much more of a central actor in managing these sorts of arrangements. So whether the United States would still prefer more flexible arrangements, we do indeed see the emergence of minilateral or plurilateral arrangements between small groupings of states that might be informal, that might not necessarily meet the definition of what I would offer, but nevertheless are important considerations all the same. I have in mind here AUKUS, Australia, United Kingdom, United States, that trilateral initiative, but that's just one amongst many. But still, the fact that they might not necessarily involve written commitments is important on its own right, and I think it's illuminating for alliance politics. So we were going to see probably the proliferation of those sorts of institutions, or arrangements rather, as countries do want to have more flexible arrangements. I still think the state is going to be the prime actor. And I still think that a lot of the alliances that we do observe, especially those led by the United States, are going to be sticking around for a while.
As part of the peace talks with Russia, we know that Ukraine is considering neutrality. What are your thoughts on this? Are there any caveats that Ukraine and its security guarantors on the other side should be considering?
So I'm not sure how to think of this issue, precisely because Ukraine was already neutral in 2014 when this whole war started. And I never really took seriously the notion that Ukraine's aspiration for NATO membership actually is driving Russian calculations here. I think the motivations for Russia are actually much more primordial than that. And I don't really see it necessarily as big of a concession as some people say, precisely because Ukraine's road to NATO membership was always very difficult, precisely because of internal opposition within the alliance. And that is why Ukraine had to settle, I don't want to say settle, but has at best achieved the status of being an enhanced opportunities partner, like Sweden and Finland for that matter, to be sure. So I know that Ukraine has been seeking these sorts of guarantees, and they're trying to implicate members of the Permanent Five and the UN Security Council, as well as neighboring countries like Poland and Germany, as well as Turkey. I suspect that's more of an effort to get those countries to get involved in any shape or form in Ukraine's security. But I don't see any sort of declaration of neutrality that Ukraine could make being a serious concession, because it's just a symbolic recognition of reality, as it were. And I don't think it's necessarily the thing that is making Russia fight Ukraine in the first place. The best guarantee for Ukraine's security right now is just taking more territory away from Russia.
Many of the examples of the alliance you've given are obviously US-led or focused on Europe in some way, but statistically, where we have conflicts is in Asia, is in South America, other places. If alliances, as you say, are about deterrence of an attack, why do you think it is that we have so few alliances in other parts of the world? Why is it always sort of a US-led European type of construction?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that exactly speaks to this issue that I raised earlier, that our common understandings of military alliances are theories that overpredict how many there should be. In fact, if alliances were simply about deterrence, then we should expect so many alliances take root all across the world. And yet, you can actually count alliances on your two hands, if that, right? There's US ROK, NATO, US Japan, US Philippines, US Thailand, ANZUS, and then CSTO, and then China and North Korea. And outside of that, you can name some regional organizations, but like the Arab League, but even so, they're not exactly a military alliance. Certainly not anything near the level of what the United States has with any of those partners I just mentioned. So I agree, like that's the puzzle, right? So if you do believe that alliances serve these sorts of purposes, then we should see a lot more of them. And for some reason, we're not. And maybe it is because there's this legalistic tradition in the West. I don't want to say that, though, because we do observe non-Western countries having treaty alliances. China certainly has them, even though its current rhetoric seems to be anti-alliance. But that might simply change because, again, there are good reasons for having a written alliance for the reasons that I mentioned. So I agree, but I don't want to necessarily say, by extension, that military alliances are random creatures in international politics, that they just emerge for no good reason. We might not have a good grasp as to what systematically causes alliance formation, or in the sense of there being a treaty signed by signatory states. But when we look at any individual alliance, we can certainly uncover the reasons for why that existed. But when we have to parse out these more general explanations, I think you're absolutely right to show that, yeah, like, why is it the case that Brazil is not part of NATO even could qualify. There's nothing precluding it, as a matter of fact, or some other alliance or relationships within Latin America or even Sub-Saharan Africa.
I'm just curious, on your list, NORAD didn't come up. Is that because you don't think of NORAD as an alliance, or?
Is it understood as an alliance? I tend to think of it as you know NORAD far better than I do. So I totally defer to your judgment, but my impression is that it's a functional arrangement, but it's not undergirded by an actual treaty commitment that's distinct from what we have in either the Augsburg Agreement or the North Atlantic Treaty. But it's really a functional relationship and a functional mission.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, in many ways, I think it is the ultimate alliance, because it requires both Canada and the US to not think about defending Canada or the US, but to defend a thing called North America. So you've got two states, you've got an agreement, and they definitely have a common goal. But it is interesting that, NORAD is often out of sight and out of mind by both Canada and the US. And we don't think of it in a NATO context either, as being the North American sort of wing to NATO. So just curious that NORAD continues to have this problem of not being recognized. Maybe there are advantages for NORAD with that. So.
Fair enough. I always assumed that it was more of a functional relationship grafted onto these other political relationships. But you're the expert on NORAD. I totally defer to your judgment. I could very well be getting this completely wrong.
Rose Havley has asked a question about the role of idealism in formation of some alliances and whether it could potentially contribute to a gap between rhetoric and reality. And if you could also perhaps address how does polarity in the current international system affect some of the alliance politics, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think, so I think ideas do matter here, in the sense that shared ideas in terms of the construction of particular threats or problems or worldviews can unite countries together in the form of these military alliances. I think some go too far to dismiss the importance of ideas altogether, whether with respect to actual ideological considerations or not. I do think that they do matter. For instance, in the Cold War, it's not by accident we had anti-communists on one side and communists on the other side, for instance. No matter some of the variation we had in regime types, obviously there was a shared understanding or idea that undergirded these sorts of things. I think people go too far in pointing out the materialist considerations. That's what I would say to that first part of the question. With respect to polarity, I have trouble grasping polarity as a general concept in international relations, precisely because to me it's a very murky, hard to define concept. But it is a key concept in international relations all the same. And so some have pointed out that entrapment concerns vary in terms of whether there is a bipolar international system as opposed to a multipolar international system. If there's a bipolar international system, then no ally should tilt the balance, because after all, they're just two superpowers, and two superpowers don't depend on any ally for their security. Whereas in a multipolar situation, as I might have said earlier, an ally might be seen as essential to having a very favorable military balance. And so if the ally is seen as more essential, then you're more likely to fight for preserving that relationship, and therefore you might take greater risks. And that's the narrative that some have had of the First World War. The basic problem is that in the bipolar context of the Cold War, the United States American decision makers were obsessed with abandonment concerns raised by their allies, they were worried about entrapment and took steps to avoid it. So they didn't really, they might have read the book on international relations theory, but they didn't accept it because their practice totally deviated from it. And with respect to the multipolar explanation of the First World War, like I said, it's not just the case that Serbia or Austria-Hungary was seen as absolutely vital to one side, that was why they had a world war. It was quite frankly simply the case that certain belligerents were hoping to have a war because they saw a worse future in the absence of war.
Since we have new and future scholars in the audience, I wanted to shift gears a little bit. And could you maybe unpack the process for writing a book and some of the lessons learned that you'd be prepared to pass along, and maybe some of the highlights of writing a book and some of the challenges?
Okay. So this was a very weird book for me to have written, as a matter of fact, because I did not actually think I was going to write this book. So I'm not sure how generalizable my own experience is. This is not a book based on a thesis. It is a book that is somewhat inspired by some earlier writings of mine on alliance politics. And basically the editor approached me, asked me if I would be interested. I demurred at first because I wasn't sure about it, but I had a son on the way. I thought I could, actually use the occasion to step back and assess what I've done so far and to think about this issue more generally in a systematic manner. And I knew I would not have to go to the archives whatsoever to do any original research. And so this was the perfect book for me to write. I signed the contract in January 2020, and my son was born in April 2020. Other things also happened in the intervening period, which totally would have precluded any sort of original research that I could have possibly done for any other project. So this is a very strange book project from which I would infer very little. But what I would say is that with respect to book writing itself, if you're writing a dissertation or a master's thesis, the process is going to be very different. You're speaking to a very different audience. You're trying to send signals about how well you know a particular literature and how well you can play with concepts or various methodological tools. When it comes to the actual book that will be published for a more general audience, however intelligent it may be, you have to cut a lot of those signals out because no one's actually interested in them. And so that process is difficult. And I think academics have trouble shifting gears in some ways from writing for another academic audience to one that's much broader. And that's the challenge that I continuously face. Jargon becomes almost the default condition. And when we're talking about complex things like alliances, the jargon is very easy to come out. So I don't know what I can really say about the lessons I've learned, but at least for this, with respect to this book. So I suppose I'll leave it at that. I don't know.
It's obvious you enjoyed the process, because it's a very easy book to follow, and there's it's obviously was a labor of love.
Yeah, no, it was definitely more love than labor, I would say, absolutely. And some chapters were easier to write than others. I thought the chapter on war was very difficult to write. But I had the benefit of having written on this issue in years past with other peer-reviewed articles. So there was some build-up. I could not have written this book from scratch without any of that previous work being done. This is a separate project from those works, and I never actually had the intention of producing such a volume. Like I said, it just was by almost mere happenstance that I was approached and eventually agreed to do this.
Thank you so much, Alexander, for sharing your journey of writing this book with us and for your insight. And thank you to our guests for joining the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies and the Center for Defense and Security Studies for this event. I hope that those who have not yet had a chance would be able to familiarize themselves with the military alliances of the 21st century, as it is an outstanding work that helps us better understand the origins and the workings of modern alliances, and also ground them in the current realities. So thank you so much to everyone. Please stay tuned for more events in the future.
Thank you so much for having me.